coming at the end of the semester. This is the final in this year's Diaspora Talk series. And we are welcoming Dr. Lisa Zay Winters, who is Associate Professor of African American Studies and English at Wayne State University in Detroit. She took her PhD in African Diaspora Studies from UC Berkeley, and her research interests include African American literature, cultures, and theories of diaspora and Black feminist theory. And this is her first book, which is maybe part of what she will talk about, maybe she won't. Okay, you will talk. Okay. The Mulatta Concubine, Terror, Intimacy, Freedom, and Desire in the Black Transatlantic. Only read the introduction, but really good work, and really good compliment for those of you who also read Dr. Shirley Thompson's work on New Orleans. And for the students from my class, you will recognize a lot of stuff from the lectures. But this is really impressive. It is published this year, 2016, from the University of Georgia Press as part of their Race in the Atlantic World, 1700 to 1900 series. And it's impressive both in its subject matter, but also its blending of methodologies. And so she's drawing on both literary studies, cultural theory, cultural studies, and historical methods to pursue an interrogation of how scholarly, popular depictions of women of mixed race, Black, African, and white racial descent defines such women as mulattoes through references to their sexual attachments to white men, which she finds as central to the practices and production of diaspora, and which provide important evidence of how freedom operates within Atlantic slave societies. And in this sense, Dr. Winters reads along, but also against the archival grain, questioning as well what we take as archives and archival records to echo the caution offered so long ago by Michel Trio that scholars should attend to how we are also engaged in producing archives. I won't belabor the point anymore, because I'm sure she can represent her work far better than I can, but I hope you do take the opportunity to pick this up if you can for my students as well, and do engage in her questions afterwards. And so, Dr. Zay Winters.
Hey, hello. Thank you for that introduction. And I just really want to thank the Warfield Center and Sheree Smith and Lise and Stephanie and Lauren and everybody's just been so welcoming during my visit here, and so I really appreciate the invitation, Philip, for keeping me with me, and I really enjoyed talking to the graduate students at lunch. So I should start off, this is, I feel like typical for my life right now. I'm going to delete the in Antebellum, New Orleans, because I'm actually going to be speaking about Antebellum, New Orleans, and Senegal. And so, but the kind of the major themes are still relevant and pressing. Okay. At the top of a flight of stairs on a landing in the Cabildo of the Louisiana State Museum hangs a portrait. The painting features a woman seated with her head turned slightly to her left as she gazes directly at the viewer. The portrait subject wears a black dress with a V-shaped neckline and cinched at the waist. Over her shoulders is draped a printed shawl with a rose on pink background. Can you hear me? Just a little bit. A little bit louder, okay, thank you. Covering the woman's hair, save for a dark brown tendril that frames her left eye, is an elaborately wrapped striped scarf, this time with a rose on white background. The woman's complexion is the color of cream, with a natural blush on her cheeks and lips. Her face is soft and round, her eyes wide and direct. Besides her scarf, her only adornment is a small dangling earring. In 2005, when I first encountered the portrait, its plaque identified the subject as Marie Laveau and described her as, quote, a legendary African-American voodoo queen in New Orleans during the early 19th century. And in 1861, French travel magazine, and there's not supposed to be an image up there, so in an article detailing Senegal's colonial history, appears an illustration depicting the Seigneur, a class of freed Black and mixed-race women who are almost always represented in the archive as mulatta and are famous for their profitable, intimate relationships with European administrators and officers in 18th century Senegal on the Antebellum islands of Saint-Louis and Gorée. Captioned Signor dans les couleurs et négresse de Saint-Louis au bain de mer, the engraving presents a signor marked clearly by her dress, who sits in the center of the scene, facing the viewer, framed by 3 black women, all unclothed from the waist up, all looking away from the viewer. The signor's clothing is elaborate and carefully arranged, and she wears the conical head wrap that signifies her status as signor. Despite the signor's multi-layered garb, which might otherwise shield her from the desiring or scornful gaze of what would have been a white French viewer, the sexuality of the illustration is almost overpowering. Her left breast appears to be bare and caressed by the voluptuous drape of cloth. She's surrounded by nearly naked and visibly black female figures. Each of these women is distinct in shade, appearance, position, and hair. They are all touching the signor, who gazes at the viewer as if unaware of her protruding breast and the spaciousness that nearly engulfs her. The visibly black women seem similarly unaware of the viewer or their own signification, as none of them looks either at the viewer or the signor. The black woman lying at the feet of the signor has her legs crossed. She leans back and tilts back her head, closing her eyes as if in absolute rapture, even as her body's position looks awkward and uncomfortable. The woman behind the signor's left shoulder contorts her body, her torso and breasts, jutting toward the signor, her head atop a neck bulging with muscles, turned away from the viewer toward the back of the scene, her left hand on her left hip. And the woman farthest away in the frame, whose skin color nearly matches that of the signor, displays a muscular back, which faces the viewer squarely, the front of her torso completely invisible to the viewer. Both of her hands are on her hips, and 2 earrings dangle on each side of her neck, these perhaps to help mark her gender in the absence of a view of her breasts and against the muscularity of her back. Atop her head is a bundle wrapped in cloth. In its grotesque objectification of the black woman framing the signor, the image both enacts and reflects the repeated colonial violation of black women's authority over the display and use of their bodies. Though it appears again in at least 2 contemporary works on Senegal, I've chosen not to replicate the image from the book here. So my descriptions here open the 2nd chapter of my book. The larger project, as we have described, traces an echo of the freed mulatta concubine across the physical and imaginative landscapes of iconic places in an African diaspora. The 18th century Senegalese islands of Gorée and Saint-Louis, Antebellum, New Orleans, and colonial Saint-Denis. I argue that across visual and written representations of the freed mulatta concubine as a historical subject on one hand and an African diaspora goddess on the other sounds a haunting echo, one that signals the centrality of the freed mulatta concubine to theorizing diaspora. I'm especially interested in how we might excavate how subjects marked female, African, black mulatta, and captive or free may have imagined and theorized the possibilities of freedom in the places they inhabited or encountered. In the 2nd chapter, I turn to the problem of privacy, intimacy, resistance, and the archive, and reading the lived experiences of free women of color in enslaved societies. So the chapter begins with the assertion that between the portrait of Marie Laveau and the illustration of the signor and her attendants travels the echo I animate throughout the book, one that in this case emanates from the near replication of the signor's head wrap in Laveau's signor. While the historical contexts that produce each figure's relationship to the head wrap are distinct, what the head wrap's appearance in these visual images produced by white and European men underscore is the scrutiny enslaved and free black women subjects endured under a white desiring gaze across the transatlantic. From travelers' journals to legal codes to newspaper accounts, the official archive obsesses over enslaved and freed black and mulatto women's sexual lives. The head wraps is worn by Marie Laveau in the portrait and by the unnamed signor in the engraving, signal an insistence on claiming privacy and authority over their own bodies, and thus serve as a point of departure for examining the dimensions and possibilities of such resistance. The first 3 sections of the chapter, subtitled Untouched, Testimony, and Terror, treat each subject discreetly. Marie Laveau and free women of Antebellum, free women of color in Antebellum, New Orleans on one hand, and the signors of 18th century Senegal on the other hand. The final section, under the an iteration of the Haitian Wa or goddess Erzuli, whose diaspora presence I consider more fully in chapter 1. I consider La Sirène as an intervention in reading the questions of privacy raised by my examinations of the dominant archives of freedom of color in Antebellum, New Orleans, in 18th century Senegal. So today I'm threading together excerpts from each chapter of the, each section of the chapter in order to think through what it means to speculate about matters of intimacy, privacy, and interiority in the lives of free women of color across the Black Atlantic. For the purposes of time, I haven't included in the talk most of the book's explicit engagements with Black feminist scholars, but hopefully, as will hopefully be apparent, they're central to my work. So the portrait of Marie Laveau that hangs in the Cabildo Museum is as fraught as it is authoritative in its representation of the notorious voodoo queen of 19th century New Orleans. While in the book I detail the multiple layers of its unknowability, for the sake of time here, I'll simply state that the portrait that hangs in the museum is a replica of an original whose location is unknown. And furthermore, the evidence in the archive raises a strong possibility that Laveau never sat for any portrait in her lifetime. Indeed, everything that might be known about Laveau, from the national and racial origins of her parents and husbands, to the number of her children, to the color of her skin, to the fact that her profession is subject to contestation. Today, I'm going to turn attention to the object that contends thrusts this portrait into Diaspora, Marie Laveau's head wrap, or tignon as it is called in New Orleans. Her distinctive head wrap is rooted in a specific event in New Orleans colonial history, a sumptuary law issued under Spanish rule directed at free women of color and more popularly known as the tignon law. Sumptuary laws directed at free women of color and loaded with moral condemnation about their supposed seduction of white men and their apparent transgressions against the sanctity and visibility of white womanhood proliferated across the 18th century Americas. These laws at once ascribed agency and authority to the women in their intimate lives and rendered it impossible for the women to define the public dimensions of these intimate lives. And across the Americas, free women of color simultaneously adhered to the letter of the law and resisted its attempts to curtail their private and public pleasure. Thus, Colin Diane describes how the mulatto courtesans of colonial Saint-Domingue responded to sumptuary laws forbidding them to wear shoes by, quote, appearing in sandals with diamonds on the toes of their feet. And Carolyn Long notes that so too did free women of color in New Orleans appear to embrace the tignon with its, quote, bright reds, blues, and yellows, wearing in public a brilliant silk handkerchief artfully knotted and perhaps enhanced with a jewel. So the head wraps were meant to force this free woman of color to be seen within the same kind of visual register of enslaved women, and free women of color like, okay, we'll wear the head wrap and what we do with it, right? In the case of New Orleans, the ban was largely symbolic, and with the transfer of New Orleans to U.S. control, no longer a legal mandate in the Antebellum city. Nonetheless, free women of color continued to wear tignons well into the 19th century. So long after the law had expired and was irrelevant, free women of color continued to wear the head wraps. Of course, not all free women of color wore the tignon, especially in the Antebellum period. And we may also imagine that those who wore the tignon did not necessarily wear it every day. So significantly, the ex-slaves interviewed for the Louisiana Writers Project did not, in fact, uniformly agree with whether Marie Laveau wore the tignon memorialized in this portrait. One informant, Mrs. Marie Bede, for example, asserted she did not wear nothing on her head or nothing on her waist like the voodoo people do today. Thus, while both the tignon and its signification may have been imposed on free women of color in colonial New Orleans, that free women of color continued to wear it into the antebellum period, that they exercised authority in when and how it was worn, that they drew from an African diasporic repertoire of dress and clothing shared by enslaved women, invite a reading that moves beyond the objectifying and desiring gaze of a white patriarchal and colonizing power. The permanency of Laveau's tignon, fantastically produced through a replica of what may be an apparently lost portrait and its prominent placement in the Louisiana State Museum, ironically emerges as an ultimate privacy shield within an archive set on exposing the intimate lives of free women of color. Indeed, read in conjunction with free women of color's prominent roles in the New Orleans-specific African diasporic religious practice of voodoo which I turn to now, these women's ownership of the Tignon articulates a deliberate protection of their intimate lives and an insistence on the unknowability of their interiority. Beginning in the 1850s and reaching a peak just after the end of the Civil War, New Orleans witnessed a series of newspaper reports documenting voodoo ceremonies in the city and the subsequent arrests of free women of color for allegedly leading these ceremonies. As several scholars have noted, including Professor Thompson, the increased attention of white residents of New Orleans to voodoo activities in the Antebellum period reflected their fear of slave insurrections and abolitionist fever, as well as their fear and anxieties about interracial sex. The flurry of arrests of free women of color practicing voodoo also underscores the surveillance of this group in Antebellum, New Orleans, of this specific group. Criminal and civil records and newspaper reports reflect the focused surveillance by police of two neighborhoods populated by free people of color, Faubourg-Marigny and Faubourg-Treme, with Faubourg-Marigny also rumored to be the preferred place for quadroon placés, those free women of color reputed to be involved in placage, placed as the mistresses of wealthy white men. Reported in the July 31st edition of the Daily Picayune was the arrest of Betsy Toledano and her voodoo sisters at a house on Conti Street located in Faubourg-Treme. According to the Daily Picayune, quote, the officers stated they had often noticed slaves entering the house and had heard singing. Yesterday evening, hearing the singing and knowing that a number of persons were inside, they drove into the building. Described as both a free colored woman and a negress in contemporaneous and historical accounts, Betsy Toledano was neither a quadroon nor likely a placé. However, her assertion of a defense of both her religious tradition and her role in leading rituals reverberates across the echo of the free mulatto concubine diaspora, an echo that sounds in the archive but resists intelligibility outside of what Bebe Clark calls diaspora literacy. Brought to court the morning following her arrest, Toledano was, quote, called up as the chief vaness of the society, as she called it. Rather than attempt to deny the accusations, she insisted that, quote, voodooism is an African religion with its signs and symbols, that she had been educated in its precepts and mysteries by her grandmother who came over from Africa, and that she never thought there was any wrong in it. Furthermore, she acknowledged that she had frequently had meetings of women only at her house to go through certain feminine mysteries, sing, etc. What compels me here is how Betsy Toledano's resistance turned on a reproduction of diaspora and imaginative articulations of Africa, and how we might use the official record's own limitations against itself in order to see her resistance. Toledano's insistence that voodooism was an African religion with its signs and symbols, that she had been educated in its precepts and mysteries by her grandmother who came over from Africa, and as a subversive paradigm for reading and producing knowledge. That is, public accounts of voodoo consistently depicted the religion as unintelligible, orgiastic savagery. Betsy Toledano's testimony offers a counter-narrative that positions her religious practice as one that demands literacy. Her statements about the signs and symbols also foreground the deliberate reproduction of that knowledge across African diasporic space and time. While Toledano makes voodoo a legible and coherent religious practice, she also insists on its unknowability. Thus, although she forthrightly explains the uses of some of the items seized by the police in the raid on her house, she steadfastly refuses to divulge all of the mysteries of her religious practice. The public account of Toledano's necklace is particularly significant here. The Daily Picayune describes how Toledano, quote, showed a necklace which she wore of beautiful seashells, of different and brilliant colors, and of a small size, which her grandmother had given her many years ago, and which gave her great power over rain, she being able thereby to bring down a shower whenever she pleased. The Daily Picayune reports that a male bystander called out, goading Toledano to use her power to sprinkle and cool the crowded room. Despite the crowd's cheering, Toledano's only response was, quote, a scornful toss of the head and curl of the lip. That she did not use the necklace to produce rain on the spot might be read as evidence of voodoo's ineffectiveness or inability to produce material results. But what if we read her silence on the terms her own testimony has articulated? Reading her delineation of how she acquired her knowledge against her insistence that the the secrets that she held were intended only for women reveals that Toledano asserted not only her authority to explain her religious tradition, but also her right to keep its most intimate aspects private, out of the purview of dominant patriarchal society. Thus, what if we read her silence in the face of the non-event of the reign as a refusal to explain more than she has already offered? What if, with the understanding that Toledano is indeed charged to protect the intimate practices of voodoo, we can imagine that the story Toledano offers regarding the necklace's value is not the true story at all. The necklace's connection to her grandmother could mean that the true story was that the sentiment Toledano attached to the necklace was too intimate a feeling to convey in a public space. In the space of her defiantly silent response to the male bystander's mocking question, Toledano held her tongue, refusing to be inscribed into the official record. Instead, she inserted a material artifact into the archive, an object that at once represents the terms of her presence in the archive and refuses to tell a story without it. Terror. The abundant descriptions of the seigneurs in 18th and 19th century travel narratives make clear that they too were under constant observation, indeed surveillance, from white European male officials invested in guiding their respective national and company policies vis-a-vis the relationships of administrators, soldiers, and employees with these women. Visiting the island of Gorée in 1758, the Reverend John Lindsay describes the women of the island as, quote, wonderfully tractable, remarkably polite both in conversation and manners, and in the point of keeping themselves neat and clean, far surpassing the Europeans in every respect. He then warns, but with these good qualities in the southern ladies, I must not omit another, though I shall leave it to yourself in what catalog to place it, whether in the noble or ignoble column. As we in England have a weapon, conveniently laid by the fireside, vocally styled the women's weapon, so have they here, but of a nature far more tremendous. There are few women who have not in their houses, ready hanging on a nail, the saw, swordfish, with which in occasions of quarrel they tear and mangle each other in a manner most dreadful. Lindsay's description reveals the extent of the surveillance to which the seigneurs were subjected, and in that revelation inadvertently offers evidence of how the women may have negotiated that surveillance. His seemingly throwaway observation of the weapon nearly every seigneur keeps, ready at hand in her home, forcefully reminds us that the seigneurs were African-descended women who lived their lives on 2 slave ports. Indeed, the seigneurs' sexual and racial identities placed them within the same visual taxonomy as the captive African women who would have lived on the islands as household slaves held by the seigneurs, or would have been forcibly moved through the island as cargo, and who most certainly would have suffered the racial and sexual violence endemic to the transatlantic slave trade. As Euro-African mixed-race concubines of European men, the seigneurs were subjects not only marked, but indeed constituted by the transatlantic slave trade. Lindsay's accusation that the women of Gorée used the saw of a swordfish to tear and mangle each other in a manner most dreadful should thus give us considerable pause. We are supposed to believe that the biggest physical threats on a racialized slave hunter facing the African-descended seigneurs were occasions of quarrel with other black and mulatto women. At the same time, the illustration depicting the seigneur and her attendants at the beach that opened my talk today underscores what, from the perspective of diaspora, is another obscenity. A seigneur's modicum of privacy is predicated upon the pornographic display of the women she holds as slaves. Thus, rather than romanticize an imagined racial and gendered sisterhood among the women with an outright dismissal of Lindsay's claims, it may be worthwhile to consider how the conditions of living as black and mixed-race women famous for their beauty, sexuality, and wealth may have shaped relationships among the seigneurs. Of black and mixed-race women who tear and mangle each other in a manner most dreadful. Echoes in both, as in the Frida, the Haitian Ola, most popularly represented as a love goddess, and in the characteristics of her sister, the battle-scarred Danto, born in the Haitian Revolution, whose tongue was cut by her own people fighting on the same side, people who could not trust her to guard their secrets. Perhaps most urgently, as the object of Frida's jealous rage for bearing the child who, as in Danto, still carries the mark of Maitress Erzuli's sword on her cheek. And here's what it means to read these archives and questions of intimacy and privacy from within Diaspora. Lindsay's desire and inability to categorize the presence and uses of the saw of the swordfish as either noble or ignoble underscore his outsider status, because what is at stake within Diaspora is not whether the women are noble or ignoble, not whether their chastity or savagery exceeds that of English women. If we understand the literal tearing of a signor's flesh to echo in the cut-off tongue and scarred cheek of Danto, then we understand that what is at stake are the very possibilities and limits of being free in Diaspora. What is at stake is how to forge and maintain the bonds of kinship and community within a freedom born of violence and seduction. In their examination of women's roles in Baudu, Claudie Michel, Patrick L.Warfield, and Marlene Toussaint began by quoting a well-known song sung in ceremonies in honor of Danto. The singer pleads with Danto to save her children from drowning. Citing the song's lines, "If you see me fall in the waters, it means we are drowning." The scholars, practitioners argue that the song reveals a free flow between me and us, between the singular and the collective. One seldom notices a change, if one ever did. While describing Danto's maternal love, including the fact that she takes care not only of her own children, but also of the children of her sister Frida, who pretends not to have them, the authors here do not mention the rivalry between the two. However, it's precisely the juxtapositions between care and peril that strike me here. In Frida's violent rivalry with Danto against her entrusting the care of her children to the mother she mutilated, and in the need for Danto's devotees to plead for her to rescue them from drowning. From here, within a diaspora that in so many ways is delineated by an archive produced from outside it, that the seigneurs may have indeed mangled each other in fierce rivalry means that these things are all true at once. They were privileged, they enjoyed a degree of safety unavailable to captive black women, and what protection that privilege may have offered is so important that they guarded it fiercely, even as a man of love and care for one another privately. And even as a protection of privilege and status was never guaranteed. Under the waters. Here again, a haunting, a possibility that the seigneurs did indeed tear and mingle each other in a manner most dreadful. For the intersection of seductive powers and potential for violence echoes not only in Frida and Danto, but yet again the third iteration of Antebellum, La Sirène, the mermaid. This haunting refuses a facile story of power and resistance, community, and affinity. It demands an accounting of the cost of that community. Listening to Ezra's iterations in Danto and La Sirène begins an accounting as it enables a shift not only from how one reads the archive, but from where one in fact sees an archive. So thus far, I've considered the view from a white patriarchal gaze and consequent experiences of that surveillance by free women of color. What the archive does not tell, of course, is how free and enslaved Africans saw and viewed the women the official record presents as free, seductive, and in control of their bodies. This is a question that the official record neither asks nor attempts to answer. Within the context of the slave trade, La Sirène's danger exceeds what might otherwise be her classical mythic function as a generic siren. Maya Deren informs her reader of the racially illegible La Sirène is said to steal children and take them to the bottom of the sea or of a stream that is known to bring them up. Another source talks about how people are captured by La Sirène and pulled into the water down to Guinea. A person, usually a woman, disappears for a time, 3 days, 3 months, 3 years. When she returns, she's a changed person. Her skin has become fairer, her hair longer and straighter. Most important, she has gained sacred knowledge. Immediately after her return, she is disoriented, does not talk, and does not remember what happened to her. Furthermore, La Sirène has the ability to bring riches and romance, but she can also be violent, and even has the power to lure mortals to a watery death. At once black and white, at once seductive and dangerous, La Sirène's pull upon her subjects into the sea and back to Africa invokes a reversal and an undoing of the middle passage. Even more than that of Frida and Danto, La Sirène's racial identity is fluid and often inscrutable. This goddess's inscrutability within an African diaspora religious practice reflects and masks the resistance to an intrusive, violating, white, male, heterosexual gaze, evident as the first three sections of the chapter insist in both mundane and sacred activities of the seigneurs in 18th century foray Islamique and of the quadroons and free women of color in Antebellum performance. While the desirability of a free mulatto concubine depends on the mere whiteness of her skin, La Sirene's inscrutability in conjunction with the white mulatto as the Frida and the black as the Dante, from both of whom she is inextricable, suggests an insistence on the part of the captive's witness to connect the goddess's seductive powers to something both black and black. To attempt resolution here would be, as Bacon Clark insists, it would undermine the principles of revision enacted in demand by her theory and practice of Marasa consciousness that propels my book's exploration of the free mulatto concubine, her archive, the impossibility of privacy, and the intimate practices of diaspora. So following Clark's beguiling and generative, quote, final comment to defamiliarize our tidy binary constructs is in Marasa practice to divine, I offer instead a pause to contemplate the water's edge. There's a song for La Sirene, cited in several places and offered here as transcribed and translated by Karen McCarthy Brown. The mermaid, the whale, my hat falls into the sea. I caress the mermaid, my hat falls into the sea. I lie down with the mermaid, my hat falls into the sea. The song is sung by La Sirene's devotees who seek either wealth, a deeper and truer picture of self, or simply comfort. As Jade Ferrat explains, however, it's usually a man who is lured by La Sirene's promise of riches, and it's this man who may soon follow his hat into the sea, drowning. Against this song, within the echo spiral, what if we consider the portrait of the seigneurs at the beach? What if we imagine the subject whose gaze she draws, helped by the overwhelming fantasy of hypersexual black womanhood that surrounds her? What if here we imagine the person who loses his hat to be that white male European whose desire for African, black, and mulatto women was inextricable from his desire for wealth and power? What if it is about the possibility that he must be careful, not because of a colonial concern for morality and the integrity of a white family and white property, but because of a desire from within diaspora, from within blackness, to imagine something besides, other than the dichotomous ways we read the free mulatto concubine, guided in this region by the dominant archive, that she was either happy to sleep her way to freedom or that she experienced every moment as a rape. How do we talk about the possibility of her power without disavowing both the injury of rape and the myriad sexual and racial violences that attended the utter imbalance of power between Europe and Africa, white and black, free and captive, male and female? What does it mean then to look for that other truth? To speculate on its dimensions, its consequences, its revelations. A tignon, a necklace of seashells, the saw of a swordfish, they each enter the archive to mark domination, ridicule, and savagery. To insist these are the markers of free black and mulatto living. Here, to ask what else they might mean, to question the official record at the risk of repeating the surveillance and violation of these women's most intimate practices and rituals, is to press upon the tension between what was desired and what happened, what we wish to have happen, and what could happen if only we could know something for sure.
So my question has to do with the archival forms in which black women's power, sort of comes to light for historians and researchers. And I'm thinking specifically about houses and property and spaces, places that free women of color, free mulatto concubines are able to sort of commandeer and then keep and manage occupation. I'm wondering how do we view those spaces in the context of
question, because it's absolutely true, right? So, in the case of, free women of color in New Orleans, as you all know, but also like in Goree and Senegal, like often free women of color enter the archive through deeds and wills and property, information about property. And what's interesting in the case of Senegal, right, is that the women don't actually write, like they enter the archive, but they're not necessarily the ones that are producing or writing the documents, right? But they're absolute evidence of one of the real concrete material benefits of freedom, right, is owning, a space and having kind of authority over that space. And I guess that's part of what I'm trying to think through, like with the Lindsay quote. It's like, so on one hand, the seniors on the islands of Goree, like they own the homes, right? But then on the other hand, you have like these random, white male visitors who are like saying, this is what's inside the house, right? And the same thing in terms of New Orleans, is so you have, free women of color owning homes, but as in the Antebellum period, there are also like a site of focused surveillance by authorities and by the police, and that these are the homes that are also being created by the police. And so, in terms of thinking about it in terms of diaspora, this is one thing that I've been working through in the book, is to think about, this is one of the material benefits of freedom for these women. Oh, and the other thing, I'm sorry. In the case of Goree and Saint Louis, you had a very interesting population in terms of captives, right? Because you had, seigneurs held household slaves, and then they were also, Goree and Saint Louis were also slave ports. They were minor slave ports, but they were slave ports nonetheless. And so you had captives passing through the slave ports, but sometimes seigneurs and the inhabitants, which were the free people of color of the two islands, they might take a slave from the slave trade and purchase them as a household slave, or they might punish a household slave by sending them off. And then also the freedom of the inhabitants was precarious as well. So I guess, I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question. These are kinds of questions that I'm thinking through as well. Is, on one hand, property is being like the thing that's supposed to keep you safe and secure, but what I'm arguing is that it's not as secure as you might imagine. So
the walls seem to be really porous.
Yeah.
And also the people who come through are subject to her power.
Exactly.
In ways that, don't produce freedom for them, but may signify kind of license for her.
Yeah, and what I think about is, again, like, I'm really interested in speculating what captives saw and process and theorize about freedom by seeing the seigneurs in these spaces, right? Seeing them move freely about these spaces, and even but then they're holding slaves themselves. So.
Yeah.
I feel like I haven't given a satisfactory answer.
No, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned briefly that there's sort of a disconnect between how the archive is representing the woman with the head wrap versus, you said the way other free women of color or women of color describe her, whether or not she wore the head wrap or how she would wear it. And I'm just curious if those accounts, like, what is the historical context of those? And are there people, like, in the contemporary moment still talking about that?
Okay, so yes.
And then do those women describe her as a mulatto, or is she talked about as a black woman? Is
Okay.
there further disconnect?
So when it comes to, and I also want to say, like, very clearly, this isn't to excuse, but it's to kind of contextualize about, like, I'm not a historian. I have really good friends who are historians, and I'm really not a historian, right? But I am attentive to that, and so we have like really different contexts. So on one hand, there's this, what I kind of like theorize as an echo of the free mulatto class diaspora, but and there are certain kind of like consistent similarities in terms of like practices of colonialism and slavery, right? But they're really different contexts. So on one hand you have Marie Laveau and free women of color in the quaternions in New Orleans, and in the Antebellum New Orleans is a different picture than colonial New Orleans. And then you have the seigneurs of 18th century Senegal. So I think you're asking more specifically about Marie Laveau and how people were talking about her. Is that
Right.
okay? So like I said, Marie Laveau's archive is completely fraught and is completely contentious. The eyewitness accounts that we have of Marie Laveau are, for the most part, not contemporaneous, save for, I think it's, I want to say it's George Washington Cable, who like in the late 19th, at the end of the 19th century, visits like a decrepit, like 90-year-old Marie Laveau right before she dies. But the eyewitness accounts in the Federal Writers Project, right, or from the Federal Writers Project, right, so you think about like the 1930s, 1940s, so people who were born into slavery, but were like, you know, if they in fact saw Marie Laveau, they would have been children. And what's important about those eyewitness accounts is that on one hand, whereas the archive and kind of popular accounts of Marie Laveau, like in tour books or whatever, always consistently represent her, like, you know, as light-skinned or as a quadroon, to a person, the Federal Writers Project, the ex-slave accounts were like, she was brown-skinned, right? And so, and I talk about that a bit in this chapter, about that kind of that contestation and that pushback against how the archive, kind of official, you know, and dominant kind of representations talk about it, and how they talk about it, and you know, are most of you who are undergraduate history students? Some of you? Oh no, okay. Because a historian, right? So in terms of kind of thinking through, like there's so many things to think through in terms of the Federal Writers Projects, right? In terms of kind of like how we read them and how we take them. But I think they represent a really kind of important intervention in popular and dominant representations. In terms of the head wrap and the tignon, again, on one hand, you know, depictions of Marie Laveau are always with her dressed with a tignon or a head wrap. But you can see 19th century antebellum portraits of free women of color mostly actually don't have free women of color wearing a tignon, right? And then again, like I said, you know, some of the ex-slaves said that she wore a head wrap, some said that they didn't. So I'm just really kind of interested in thinking through that there is the fact of the tignon law, and there is the fact of free women of color resisting the tignon law with kind of extravagant head wraps, right? So to say like, no, this, you know, this marker that you want to make me look like a slave, in fact, I will like kind of, you know, thrust like my wealth and in your face with it, right? And so I'm really interested in kind of like how that functions in terms of them resisting kind of an intrusion into their intimate relationships. And when I talk about intimacy in the chapter, I'm not only talking about their sexual relationships, I'm talking about like kinship relationships. I'm talking about all the kinds of relationships that we have within the privacy of our own homes, like kinship relationships, relationships with their sisters, with friends, right? You think about like the head wrap and hairdressing is a really intimate practice. And so I think about, you know, who, for free women of color, who did their hair? Was it other free women of color? Was it the slaves that they held, right? And how, you know, and how we can kind of like think through questions of intimacy and kinship in that way.
Your analysis of like Gloucester and the mermaidness with like mysterious women specifically in New Orleans and stuff, and like when they reclaim the spaces that are seen as like places where they're not, where other people are dominant, like for example when you were talking about like luring in European men and then immediately taking them to their death, I guess, like was seen as part of the mermaid or whatever. But my question is like, when women go out to reclaim these spaces, but they're seen as like sexually available through like all men and stuff. So where do we see like, or how do we determine what is violence and what is like sexual liberty? Because it's always a question when we're looking at like sexual practices or any practices of like mulatto women or mixed race Black women.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for me, I'm taking up very explicitly and deliberately at this stereotype of the free mulatto concubine, right? And I talk a bit about why I use that phrase to kind of hold precisely those scenes of tension that you're talking about, right? So, for example, I always like to put like free and the free with the D like in parentheses to kind of maintain like that focus and that link to slavery and to kind of underscore the precariousness of their freedom. But I do think at the same time it's important to like not vacate like agency and power, right? Not to like and not to kind of erase any possibility that free women of color had authority over their sexuality. And that's kind of like where I'm trying to figure out what is that space in between, right? And so, and a lot of my work, right, is kind of like saying, let's open up this possibility, and let's kind of sit there for a moment, right? So, I mean, all I can say, I think, is like that I agree with your question and your concern, but I also am very emphatic in the book, I think, about always kind of thinking about the economy of slavery, because what you see across Atlantic slave societies are that free people of color are always trying to maintain their freedom. It's never like a given, right? It's never something that they can just kind of like rest easy and be like, okay, we're free, you know. And also that there's this really interesting, I think I talked about in the first chapter, there's this really interesting kind of passage from Manuel de Saint-Marie, who wrote about colonial Saint Louis, and he talks about free women of color and their relationships with the enslaved women. And so also kind of remembering that like free women of color don't just kind of like appear out of nowhere, and that once people become free, their kinship ties with enslaved people don't disappear. So that's why it's really important to kind of hold onto that kind of precariousness and threat of sexual violence, because it doesn't disappear.
Well, you brought up the summary, and my classmate had one quote from that that was talking about really sexualized language that he's using to describe mixed race women and men. And listening to, reading the introduction and listening to your presentation as well, I started to wonder about, I guess, the practice of engaging in archive, but against the grain of kind of reading, because these are sources that are kind of bequeathed to us by the powerful, but then how do we, I guess, responsibly read that for an alternative story? And so I'm thinking of James Sweet, what he does with the most algorithms to kind of get this much different picture of a slave traveling from the home to Brazil and Portugal. So why don't you just talk about what kind of challenges you found as a non-historian to engage in that question and or to engage in that practice, and just my own professional curiosity. How have historians responded to this, if they have at all?
I'll answer the second question first. I don't really know, besides like my colleague at Wayne Kadada, who's probably read every version of every draft of this book, and so she's been like my kind of grounding, you know, whatever the metaphor would be. Like she grounds, like, you know, kind of my engagement with the archive. But she's my friend, so I don't, you know, she likes it, but, you know, and she thinks I do a good job, but she's my friend, so I don't know. You know, but that said, I try to be really mindful of checking in what I want to see so that I'm not reading that unconsciously into the archive, right? Like, no, I'm not a historian, but I think that evidence is really important. And I don't want to tell a story that is, I mean, I'm not a novelist, right? So I don't want to tell a story that is just fantastic, as much as, you know, I think that we need those stories. Like, that's not what I'm doing, right? But I am trying to kind of push us to kind of imagine responsibly. Yeah, I'm just trying to think, you know, in the book, in chapter 3 of the book, like I found this letter when I was at the French Colonial Archives, and I found this, I found this letter from a free, a self-described negress, a 1737 letter from a self-described negress on the island of Gorée, writing to the company officials saying, my husband died, now the company wants, you know, I have a daughter, and the company wants to take all of her property, and that goes against company policy, and the French trading company is like in charge, and I'm writing like on behalf of my daughter. Now, though that letter is in the archive, though it's clearly from Gorée, clearly from the time when the seigneurs would be in power is too strong a word, but that letter is not mentioned at all in like the scholarship on the seigneurs. Like that letter, and the way the letter is indexed is like the widow's bond. So it doesn't, it's not indexed as a seigneur, it's not indexed as you know, free woman of color. But she clearly signs it negress. And so I guess I bring that up that, you know, I'm also concerned with like what people don't see when they're looking through the archive, right, to tell a certain story. And so maybe that's where the methodology is for me, is like, okay, here's something I haven't seen, now I need to think about why hasn't anybody talked about this, and what can I say about it? And so that becomes part of the project, and I think maybe that's part of where, you can correct me if I'm wrong, like that's kind of where I'm not a historian, right? Because I'm not just kind of, I should say Jess, I'm not, but I'm as interested in why we haven't seen something as what I can't find. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and I guess I would be critical in this in saying that I actually try and encourage graduate students particularly to try and approach archives thinking about what they want to say, as opposed to just assuming they're going to find whatever is there. I see it as productive. I also see it can be loose. You can play with stuff a bit too much, but I think it's still, I appreciate that approach, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's something I have a hard time kind of nailing down. Like, so last summer I presented at, I was on a panel for SHEAR, for the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, and I was the only person on the panel that was not a historian, and so I emailed Kadava. I was like, and I was really concerned about explaining in my paper how what I'm doing is different from a historian's project, but nonetheless kind of important. And she was like, just don't worry about that. Like, just do your work, right? And so I think that she's like, historians are going to know you're not a historian, but that doesn't kind of, you're doing something that historians can't do, right? I don't know.
No.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.